Last week we met scientist Dr. Nancy Lane at Cambridge University in England. This week, Dr. Lane shares with Delicious Ambitious her tips for networking, a skill which is useful in science and other professions, as well as for building a business. So, what is networking?
Well, networking is when you go to any occasion at all where there are other people, you want to get to know the other people and discover what things you have in common with those other people. Now, my view is that what's a very good thing to do is to know in advance what they might have in common with you. And what that means is you need to know who the other guests are at any given event you're going to. So what I always try and do is go to an event, and I know it's going to be a networking event, say, early, and either look at the guest list if there is one, or look at the name tags on the table before the other guests come. And then I can say, oh, X is coming. I've always wanted to meet X, and X would be very useful to me because they're in my field of science, or they're doing something, whatever it might be. And then I know that I can keep an eye out for them. Now, if I don't know what they look like, the thing you then do is to ask your host or hostess, could you please introduce me to X, or could you just point X out to me, and I can go up and introduce myself. Because you've got to be prepared to do that at a networking event. You've got to be able to go up and say hello. In fact, that's the one thing you don't want to do, is to hang around in the periphery and think, oh, I don't know anybody. You have to go up and say, hello, I'm whatever your name is, and I'm a scientist and in such and such a field, and I'm very interested to meet you. What's your subject, and etc. Now, having said this bit about trying to discover who you want to meet, the other thing I feel quite strongly about is that you need to do a bit of homework. If there's somebody you want to meet, you don't want to just go in cold. You want to say, oh, okay, this person is from Australia, and I wonder if they have been to X. You try and find out something about their background or their interests, so you can actually be knowledgeable when you have your initial conversation with them, which it pleases people. They don't like to think you have no idea who they are. They're quite flattered if you can say, well, I know you're from Australia, and you do such and such. They quite like that. So that, I think, is quite a useful thing. The thing is, I wish I'd realized how important it was to be able to network, how important it was that once you'd met someone, you needed to take down their name and address, you needed to establish that they knew you, to make sure that you could see them again by saying, well, if I call, or if I write, or whatever. So that it's not that you're using people, it's just that you're saying, right, well, now I know this person, and they do such and such, well, maybe they could give me some advice, and that they make sure that they've, something like a business card. Nobody who's a scientist ever has a business card, but actually, it's kind of a good idea to have one. If you go to a meeting and you meet a bunch of people that you want to be able to keep in contact with, if you start scribbling your name down on a bit of raw end of paper, and it'll be lost or they won't find it, a decent card will tell them who you are, what your email address is, where your lab is, and how they can reach you if they want to reach you by telephone. It's just a very useful thing to have. And I didn't realize that until fairly recently.
And what do you do with the business cards you collect at networking events?
In networking, one of the things that, of course, has become recently available is this issue of having a card. But one of the problems with that is that you go to a networking event, you collect cards, and at the end of it, next week you look at them and you've got 10 cards and you have no idea who anybody is. So what you do, in my view, as soon as you've left the networking event, you take those cards and you write down just a fact or two on the back of the card about that person. Short, blonde, curly hair, wearing a bright scarlet dress, very interested in X or Y, or I should try and contact them about this, or they are knowledgeable about that. And then what's very important is to follow up. If you've actually said, I'll let you know about that, or that's an interesting point and I might have some information for you, make sure you do it, because there's nothing worse than having said you do something for someone and then not doing it. And so, of course, equally it means that if you've got the information on the card, you can remember, oh, that was the person I was going to send that information to. Oh, and X was the one that I promised I'd find out Y. And if you don't make those little notes, immediately the party's over, or within that same day, you're going to forget it. It's amazing. You think, oh, which one was that? I can't remember. Because the names you haven't really possibly heard all that often before. And you've got to link the name to an image.
So why is networking important?
I think in a way it's important because you don't have a chance to meet these people. If you're a scientist particularly, you're working in your lab, and yes, you may actually meet other people in your own university, but actually not as often as you might like, unless you're fortunate you're at Oxford or Cambridge where you've got a college, and there at the colleges, of course, you can meet people in all sorts of other subjects. But going to places where you have a chance to meet someone that you wouldn't otherwise have a chance to meet, this can be hugely valuable, because you make that contact in these networking situations, and then you can go back to it and call upon it and all these sorts of things, which you could never do otherwise. So the number of people I've met through going to things in London, and by the way, sometimes you're invited to something, you think, oh, can I face it? I'm so tired, oh dear. But actually, you probably will regret it if you don't go, because having gone, you then discover you meet all these people you didn't know you were going to meet, and gosh, that really can have terrific advantages from the point of view of your work.
Are there any challenges associated with networking?
Well, I think, of course, the obvious challenge is trying to have a conversation that's meaningful with the person you're meeting, particularly if it's somebody that is pretty well known, and you don't want them to think you're a jerk. So you can't be sort of, well, it's particularly difficult with celebrities. You meet a celebrity and what do you say? In fact, I think probably in science, a celebrity isn't a celebrity in the conventional terminology, but it's somebody who's very big in science. And so I think that the important thing is not to be gooey and say, oh, I think you're wonderful. You simply have to have something to say to them that's meaningful and significant. That's where the homework comes in, of course. You should know about their subject. You should be able to ask them a question that's a meaningful question, that's a reasonable question, that's an interesting question. I would always think a provocative question. Then they'll remember you. Think, oh, that was the kid who asked me that question about X. Bright boy or bright girl, and maybe I should remember them, or maybe that's someone might want to have in our lab. You want the person to remember you. But of course, there are different ways to make them remember you. And there was one wonderful occasion when Sylvia Plath, the famous poet, first met Ted Hughes, who became, of course, Poet Laureate. She wanted to make him remember her, so what did she do? She leaned across and bit his ear. I'm not sure that that's something that scientists would do, but it's a lovely idea. You want to make them remember you. You've got to find some way, and a clever question is better than biting an ear.
How do you make the most of networking opportunities?
Well, I think it's very important to be very open and friendly when you go to these parties, and not to allow yourself to lack confidence. In other words, you have to move out into this room where you find yourself at this gathering and go and approach people quite openly. I think it's very important always to be friendly about it and not to be aggressive, because of course people hate the feeling that somebody's kind of coming at them. So you have to be polite and friendly, but not aggressive. But you have to be confident that you'll have something interesting to say to them too. I feel that to avoid networking is to miss opportunities to meet people who just could be very helpful in your career. Apart from that, of course, there's a hugely important bit that you make friends. And indeed, a lot of people have found they've made firm friends through these networking events. And that's actually quite important in life too, to have a few very good friends.
And what if you're a naturally shy person?
Well, that's what I meant by the confidence and pretending to be confident. That even if you're shy, you have to put that to one side, put on this armour of confidence, and go out there. Because, of course, it's terribly tough. I was incredibly shy as a child. I couldn't say boo to a goose. And I just would go to parties and just stand there feeling terribly anxious and worried. So I think part of it is to know what you want to ask the person. So once you say, well, I'd like to meet you because I want to talk about X or Y, then you sort of hope that you know about that, and that may help you overcome the shyness because you're talking about something that you actually know about. If it's a general conversation, then what you have to do is try and lead it towards a topic that you are knowledgeable about. And one of the things you can do is bring up a topic that something you've done, an exhibition you've seen, or something or other you've read, a book. Have you read this? And it's a very interesting issue here about thus and so. And engage them in an intellectual debate is often very useful, because then they say, oh yes, that's an interesting topic. In other words, not banalities, but something meaningful that you can get your teeth into.